In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, a priceless map vanishes, and a man lies dead stabbed in his own study. Was it greed, betrayal, or a secret worth killing for? As whispers of treasure and treachery swirl, only one mind can unravel the truth. Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind. Who hid the map? Why did the clock stop ticking? And what dark motive lurks behind the polite smiles of this closed circle? Step into a web of lies where every clue counts, and the final twist will leave you stunned. Chapter 1. The invitation to Blackthorn Helen. The drowsy warmth of a late August afternoon in 1935. The village of St. Mary Mead lay bathed in the golden haze of summer. The hedgerows were heavy with blackberries, and the air carried the faint scent of hay from the fields beyond the vicarage. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favorite armchair by the window of her neat little cottage, was knitting a pale blue shawl for her niece's newborn. Her needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her advancing years, flickered occasionally to the garden, where her young maid, Lily, was hanging laundry with a dreamy air. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were not on the laundry or even the shawl. They were on the letter that had arrived that morning, its crisp envelope now resting on the tea table beside her. The handwriting was bold, almost impatient, and the crest embossed at the top spoke of old money and older pride. It was an invitation from Lady Beatrice Haverford, mistress of Blackthorn Hall, a sprawling estate some 20 miles from St. Mary Mead. The occasion was a weekend gathering to celebrate the engagement of Lady Beatrice's nephew, Captain Roland Haverford, to Miss Clara Winthrop, a young woman of impeccable lineage but, as village gossip whispered, limited means. Curious, Miss Marple murmured to herself, her needles pausing. She adjusted her spectacles and reread the letter. Lady Beatrice, whom Miss Marple had met once at a charity bazaar, was not known for spontaneity. Her invitations were deliberate, her gatherings meticulously planned. Yet this one, penned in her own hand rather than a secretary's, carried an undertone of urgency. A map? Of all things, Miss Marple said softly, recalling the postscript. Do come, dear Miss Marple. You're keen I might be of use in a matter concerning an old family map. Maps, in Miss Marple's experience, were seldom mere curiosities. They pointed to treasure, secrets, or, more often than not, trouble. She folded the letter and rose, her movements precise despite the slight stiffness in her knees. Lily, she called, fetch my writing case. I shall accept Lady Haverford's invitation. Blackthorn Hall stood at the edge of a wooded valley, its gray stone foliage softened by ivy and flanked by manicured lawns. By Friday evening, as Miss Marple's taxi rattled up the gravel drive, the house glowed with the warmth of countless lamps, casting long shadows across the rose gardens. She was greeted by a butler, Mr. Grayson, whose impeccable manners could not quite mask a faint strain in his expression. Miss Marple, madam, he said, bowing. Lady Haverford is in the drawing room. Allow me to take your coat. The drawing room was a study in opulence, crystal chandeliers, mahogany furniture, and portraits of stern-faced Haverfords glaring from the walls. A fire crackled in the hearth, though the evening was mild. The assembled guests, numbering 12, turned as Miss Marple entered, their conversation pausing like a gramophone needle lifted mid-tone. Lady Beatrice, a tall woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned in an elegant chignon, rose to greet her. Miss Marple, how good of you to come, she said, her voice warm but her eyes searching. You know my nephew, Roland, of course, Captain Roland Haverford. A handsome man in his early 30s with a soldier's bearing, offered a charming smile. Delighted, Miss Marple. Aunt Beatrice speaks highly of your insight. His fiancée, Clara Winthrop stood beside him, her delicate features framed by auburn curls. She murmured a polite greeting, but her hands twisted nervously. At her sides, the other guests were a varied lot, each introduced with the careful formality of a society gathering. There was Dr. Ernest Caldwell, a retired physician with a penchant for archaeology. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, a widowed cousin of Lady Beatrice with a sharp tongue. Mr. Felix Mortimer, a solicitor with a pinched face and a habit of adjusting his cufflinks. And Miss Sylvia Gray, a young artist whose bohemian air seemed at odds with the room's grandeur. Rounding out the party were Mr. and Mrs. Harold Baxter, a wealthy industrialist couple. Their daughter, Evelyn, a restless girl of 20, Major. Gregory Walsh, a bluff military friend of Roland's, and Mr. Thomas Ridley, a quiet historian who seemed more interested in the hall's library than its guests. Miss Marple settled into a corner armchair, her knitting in her lap, and observed. The room buzzed with polite chatter, but beneath it ran a current of unease. Roland and Clara exchanged glances that were not entirely those of blissful lovers. Mrs. Trent's laughter was too shrill, Mr. Mortimer's too forced, and Lady Beatrice, for all her poise, kept glancing at a locked mahogany box on the mantelpiece. Dinner was announced at 8, a lavish affair of roast pheasant and claret. Miss Marple, seated between Dr. Caldwell and Miss Gray, listened more than she spoke. Dr. Caldwell waxed lyrical about a Roman dig he'd funded in Dorset, while Miss Gray described her latest painting. A map, she said, inspired by an old legend of Blackthorn Hall. A map? Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. How intriguing. Is it one of the families? Miss Gray hesitated, her fork pausing. Not exactly. It's inspired by one I saw in the library. A curious thing, full of odd symbols. Lady Beatrice, at the head of the table, cleared her throat. The Haverford map, she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. A family heirloom, said to mark the location of a treasure hidden by my great-grandfather during the Napoleonic Wars. It's more myth than fact, I'm afraid. Yet you keep it locked away, Mrs. Trent remarked, her eyes glinting. Afraid. Someone will steal it, Beatrice. The table fell silent. Lady Beatrice's smile was tight. One can never be too careful, Lavinia. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. She noted the flush on Clara's cheeks, the way Roland's hand tightened on his glass, and the brief, sharp glance Mr. Ridley cast at the mahogany box. The map, it seemed, was no mere curiosity. After dinner, the guests retired to the drawing room for coffee. Miss Marple excused herself to freshen up, taking the opportunity to study the house's layout. The corridors were lined with portraits and heavy oak doors, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and history. As she passed the library, she heard raised voices Roland and Clara. She thought, though the words were indistinct, something about promises and debts returning. To the drawing room, she found the mood altered. Lady Beatrice stood by the mantel, her face pale. It's gone, she said, her voice trembling. The map? The box is empty. A murmur rippled through the guests. Roland strode to the mantel, his jaw tight. When did you last see it? And this morning, she replied. I checked it myself. The box was locked. The key in my possession. Mr. Grayson, the butler, stepped forward. I assure you, madam, no one entered the drawing room unattended. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room. The guests were a tableau of shock, suspicion, and, in some cases, poorly concealed satisfaction. She noted the time 9:47 p.m. and the position of each person, Roland by the mantel, Clara clutching his arm, Mrs. Trent by the window, Mr. Mortimer near the door, and the others scattered about the room. The map theft was no small matter, she sensed. But what intrigued her more was the undercurrent of fear it had unleashed. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but carrying, we might discuss this calmly. A map, after all, is only paper unless it points to something more. Lady Beatrice met her gaze, and for a moment, Miss Marple saw not the poised hostess, but a woman grappling with a deeper dread. Indeed, Miss Marple, she said, I fear it points to far more than we know. As the clock struck 10, Miss Marple settled back into her chair. Her knitting resumed. The theft of the Haverford map was a puzzle, and puzzles, in her experience, were solved not by haste, but by the quiet observation of human nature. She would watch, and she would listen. The truth, she was certain, would reveal itself in time. Chapter 2. The shadow of the Crimith drawing room at Blackthorn Hall, moments after Lady Beatrice's announcement of the stolen map, was a study in controlled chaos. The fire's glow cast flickering shadows on the faces of the guests, each of whom seemed to wear a mask of surprise, indignation, or subtle calculation. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in her corner, let her knitting needles slow to a deliberate pace, her eyes darting from one figure to another. The theft of the Haverford map, she sensed, was not merely a loss of an old parchment, but a spark that had ignited long-simmering tensions. Lady Beatrice, still standing by the mantel, clutched the empty mahogany box as if it might yield answers. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but laced with strain. I cannot fathom how this happened. The box was locked, the key in my bedroom safe. Only Grayson, and I have access. Mr. Grayson, the butler, stood rigidly by the door, his face a mask of professional calm. I assure you, madam, I have not touched the key since you entrusted it to me this morning. Captain Roland Haverford paced before the fireplace, his military precision at odds with the flush on his cheeks. This is absurd, he said, his voice sharp. Who would steal a map? It's a family relic, not a sack of gold. Clara Winthrop, his fiancée, hovered near him, her delicate hands twisting a lace handkerchief. Perhaps it was a mistake, she ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone might have misplaced it. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, perched on a velvet settee, let out a bark of laughter. Misplaced? My dear Clara, you're too kind. Someone in this room has sticky fingers, and I'd wager it's not the first time. The accusation hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the reactions it provoked. Mr. Felix Mortimer, the solicitor, adjusted his cufflinks with a nervous twitch. Dr. Ernest Caldwell, sipping his coffee, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Miss Sylvia Gray, the artist, stared at her hands, her lips pressed into a thin line. The Baxters' Herald, his wife Margaret, and their daughter Evelyn exchanged glances that suggested private knowledge. Major Gregory Walsh, standing by the window, muttered something about damned impertinence, while Mr. Thomas Ridley, the historian, peered over his spectacles, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple cleared her throat, her voice gentle but firm. Might I suggest, Lady Beatrice, that we establish precisely when the map was last seen? A timeline, I find, often clarifies matters. Lady Beatrice nodded, grateful for a practical suggestion. Of course. I saw the map this morning at 8, when I opened the box to ensure it was secure. I locked it again and placed the key in my safe. The box has not left the drawing room all day, and no one entered the room unattended. Miss Marple asked, her eyes on Grayson. No, madam, the butler replied. The staff were present only to serve tea at 4, and I supervised them myself. The guests were in and out, but never alone. Roland stopped pacing. Then it must have happened during the day, when we were all milling about. Someone slipped in, picked the lock, and took it. Picked the lock, Mr. Mortimer said, his tone skeptical. That's no small feat. The box looks sturdy, and the lock is no trinket. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the mahogany box, its brass fittings gleaming in the firelight. May I examine it? She asked. Lady Beatrice handed it over, and Miss Marple turned it carefully in her hands. The lock was indeed robust, with no visible scratches or signs of tampering. Curious, she murmured. A skilled thief, or perhaps someone with a key. There is no other key, Lady Beatrice said firmly. Only mine, and it has not left my possession. Miss Marple nodded, returning the box. Then we must consider who had opportunity. Perhaps, Lady Beatrice, you could tell us more about this map. Its significance might point to a motive. The room grew quiet, all eyes on the hostess. Lady Beatrice hesitated, then sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The Haverford map is an old family legend. My great-grandfather, Sir Edmund Haverford, was said to have hidden a fortune during the Napoleonic Wars. Gold, jewels, perhaps papers of political value. The map, drawn in his hand, supposedly marks its location somewhere on the estate. No one has ever found it, and many doubt it exists. But the map itself is priceless to us, a piece of our history, and worth stealing. Major Walsh asked gruffly. Perhaps, Lady Beatrice admitted, to a collector, or someone desperate enough to believe the treasure is real. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. And who among you knew of the map's existence? A murmur passed through the group. Roland raised his hand. We all did, I suppose. It's a family story told at every gathering. Clara knew, of course. He glanced at his fiancée, who nodded faintly. I heard it years ago, Mrs. Trent said, her eyes narrowing. Though I never thought it worth stealing. Dr. Caldwell leaned forward. As an archaeologist, I find such artifacts fascinating. I asked Beatrice about it last month when I visited. Miss Gray spoke up, her voice soft. I saw it in the library last week when I was sketching. Lady Beatrice showed it to me. Mr. Ridley adjusted his spectacles. I, too, examined it, purely for historical interest. You understand. It's a remarkable document, 18th century cartography. The Baxters remained silent, but Evelyn, their daughter, fidgeted, her eyes darting to her parents. Mr. Mortimer cleared his throat. I knew of it, but only as a curiosity. I handle the family's legal affairs, not their myths. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging each admission. Everyone had known of the map, and several had seen it recently. Opportunity, it seemed, was not in short supply. The conversation was interrupted by a scream from the hallway. The guests froze, then rushed toward the sound, Miss Marple following at a more measured pace. In the corridor, they found Lily, Miss Marple's young maid, standing pale and trembling, a silver tray at her feet. I saw someone, she stammered, outside, by the library window. A shadow, moving fast. Roland and Major Walsh dashed to the window, but the garden beyond was dark. The only movement the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Nothing there now, Walsh growled. Probably a fox, or a thief, Mrs. Trent said, her tone gleeful. Miss Marple knelt beside Lily, her voice soothing. Tell me, my dear, exactly what you saw. Lily swallowed. It was just after 10, ma'am. I was bringing tea from the kitchen when I saw a figure tall, I think, in a dark coat. They were near the library window. Then they vanished into the shrubbery. Miss Marple patted her hand. You've done well to tell us. Now, don't be frightened. She rose, her eyes meeting Lady Beatrice's. Perhaps we should secure the house just to be safe. Grayson and the footman were dispatched to check the doors and windows while the guests returned to the drawing room, their nerves frayed. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her mind turning over the evening's events. The map's theft was troubling, but Lily's sighting suggested something more immediate: a prowler. Perhaps, or someone who had not left the house at all. As the clock struck 11, Lady Beatrice announced that the police would be called in the morning, as the local constable was unavailable that night. Until then, she said, I trust we can all remain calm. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Calmness, Lady Beatrice, is most conducive to clear thought. I shall retire now, but I assure you, I am most interested in this little puzzle. As she made her way to her room, escorted by a nervous footman, Miss Marple's mind was far from rest. The map's theft was a clever crime, executed under the noses of a dozen people. But it was the undercurrents, the glances, the hesitations, the unspoken fears that intrigued her most. Someone in Blackthorn Hall had a secret, and secrets, in her experience, had a way of unraveling. She paused at her door, her eyes lingering on the darkened corridor. A map that leads to danger, she murmured. But whose danger, I wonder? Chapter 3. The arrival of inquiry's morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Blackthorn Hall, casting a soft glow over the breakfast room where the guests gathered in uneasy silence. The theft of the Haverford map had left its mark. The polite chatter of the previous evening was replaced by guarded glances and murmured pleasantries. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end of the table with a cup of tea and a modest plate of toast, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, a prop that allowed her to blend into the background while her sharp eyes missed nothing. Lady Beatrice, presiding over the table, looked drawn, her silver hair slightly less immaculate than the night before. I've telephoned Inspector Crane, she announced, her voice firm despite the strain in her eyes. He'll be here by noon to investigate the theft. Until then, I ask you all to remain on the estate. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, buttering a scone, with unnecessary vigor, gave a derisive snort, as if any of us would flee like common criminals. Really, Beatrice, this melodramatic air doesn't suit you. Captain Roland Haverford, seated beside Clara Winthrop, shot his cousin a sharp look. Aunt Beatrice is right to be cautious. Lavinia, that map is irreplaceable, and someone here took it. Clara, pale and silent, kept her eyes on her plate, her fingers crumbling a piece of toast. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands and the way Roland's gaze softened when it fell on her, though his jaw remained tight. Felix Mortimer, the solicitor, cleared his throat. I trust the inspector will handle this discreetly. The Haverford name needn't be dragged through the mud over a piece of old parchment. Old parchment? Mr. Thomas Ridley, the historian, looked up from his coffee, his mild eyes glinting with indignation. The map is a historical artifact, Mr. Mortimer. Its loss is a tragedy, not a trifle. Miss Sylvia Gray, sketching idly on a napkin, spoke, without looking up. It's more than history. It's a story, a treasure, a secret. Someone thought it worth stealing. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the previous night's events. The locked box, the absent key, Lily's sighting of a shadowy figure, all pieces of a puzzle that refused to align. She was about to inquire about the library window when the door burst open, and Grayson, the butler, entered, his face ashen. Madam, he said, addressing Lady Beatrice, there's been an incident in the library. You must come at once. The guests rose as one, their breakfast forgotten. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her stick tapping lightly on the polished floor. The library was a grand room, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and its windows overlooking the rose garden. But the sight that greeted them was far from serene. Mr. Thomas Ridley lay slumped over a reading table, his spectacles askew, and a thin trickle of blood seeping from a wound at his temple. A heavy brass paperweight, shaped like a lion's head, lay beside him, its base stained red. The room was silent save for Clara's stifled gasp and Mrs. Trent's sharp intake of breath. Dr. Ernest Caldwell, the retired physician, pushed forward and knelt beside Ridley. After a moment, he looked up, his face grim. "He's dead. Struck, I'd say, no more than an hour ago." Lady Beatrice swayed, and Roland caught her arm. "Grayson, fetch the police at once," she said, her voice trembling. "And no one is to touch anything." Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes scanning the scene. Ridley's right hand rested on an open book, a treatise on 18th century cartography. She noted. A single sheet of paper, folded neatly, protruded from his waistcoat pocket. The library window was ajar, a faint breeze stirring the curtains. On the floor beneath the table, half hidden by a rug, was a single pearl earring. "Poor Mr. Ridley," Miss Marple murmured, though her tone was more thoughtful than mournful. She bent slightly, her eyes lingering on the earring. "How curious that he should be here so early, and alone." Major Gregory Walsh, who had been silent until now, spoke gruffly. "Probably caught the thief in the act. Damned fool tried to play hero." "Or he was the thief," Mrs. Trent said, her eyes gleaming with speculation, "and someone took exception." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was racing. Ridley's interest in the map had been academic, or so he claimed. Yet here he was, dead in the very room where Miss Grey had seen the map, struck down with a weapon close at hand. The earring, too, was a clue, small, but significant. She glanced at the women in the room: Clara, Mrs. Trent, Miss Grey, Mrs. Baxter, and Evelyn. None wore pearls, but that meant little. Earrings were easily lost, or planted. By noon, Inspector Crane arrived. A stocky man with a bristling mustache and a no-nonsense air. He surveyed the library with a practiced eye, his notebook already open. "Right, then," he said, addressing the assembled guests. "No one leaves the house until I've spoken to each of you. Mr. Grayson, I'll start with you. The rest wait in the drawing room." Miss Marple, seated once more with her knitting, listened as the guests murmured among themselves. The inspector's arrival had shifted the atmosphere. Suspicion now hung openly in the air. Roland and Clara sat close together, their heads bent in whispered conversation. Mrs. Trent watched them with a smirk, while Mr. Mortimer paced, muttering about schedules. The Baxters, unusually quiet, kept Evelyn between them, her restless energy subdued. Miss Grey sketched feverishly, her pencil scratching against paper, and Dr. Caldwell stared out the window, his face unreadable. Major Walsh approached Miss Marple, his voice low. "You've a reputation, ma'am, for sorting out messes like this. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "It is early yet, Major, but I find that death, like theft, is rarely impulsive. Mr. Ridley's presence in the library at such an hour suggests purpose, as does the choice of weapon." Walsh grunted. "You think it was planned?" "I think," she said mildly, "that everything in this house has a purpose, even if we do not yet see it." Inspector Crane's interviews were thorough but brisk. He called Miss Marple last, regarding her with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Miss Marple, is it? Lady Beatrice says you've a knack for noticing things. What's your take on this, Miss?" Marple folded her hands over her knitting. Mr. Ridley was a scholar, inspector, with a particular interest in the stolen map. His death in the library, so soon after its theft, suggests a connection. I would look closely at the alibis for this morning, particularly between 7 and 8 o'clock. Crane raised an eyebrow. Alibis, eh? And what about this earring? He held up a small evidence bag containing the pearl. A clue, perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or a distraction. Women's jewelry is easily lost, but also easily placed. Crane grunted, jotting a note. Anything else? Only this, she said, her voice soft. The map's theft was bold, but Mr. Ridley's death is desperate. Someone in this house is afraid. Inspector, and fear makes people careless. As she returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple's mind turned to the timeline. Breakfast had been served at 8, but Ridley was already dead. The household had been stirring by 7 maids cleaning, footmen preparing, guests dressing. Someone had slipped into the library unnoticed, and that someone had known Ridley would be there. The earring, the open window, the folded paper in Ridley's pocketall were threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to weave. She glanced at the mantel, where the empty mahogany box still stood. The map had led to danger, just as Lady Beatrice feared. But Miss Marple suspected the real danger lay not in the map itself, but in what it had stirred among the guests of Blackthorn Hall. Chapter 4. The questions beginning. Drawing room at Blackthorn Hall was heavy with tension, as the afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the sharpness of her gaze. Inspector Crane had concluded his initial interviews and was now in the library with a constable, examining the scene of Mr. Ridley's murder. The guests, confined to the drawing room under the watchful eye of a young policeman, shifted uneasily in their seats, their earlier politeness fraying like an old tapestry. Miss Marple observed them quietly, her mind sifting through the morning's revelations. The death of Thomas Ridley, struck down in the library, had transformed the theft of the Haverford map from a curious incident into a deadly affair. The pearl earring, the open window, and the folded paper in Ridley's pocket were all pieces of a puzzle, but it was the behavior of the guests that intrigued her most. Fear, guilt, and secrecy were written in their glances, their hesitations, their too careful words. Lady Beatrice, seated by the fire, maintained her composure, but her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, betraying her strain. Captain Rowland Haverford stood by the window, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the garden as if searching for answers in the rosebeds. Clara Winthrop, his fiancée, sat beside him, her face pale and her fingers twisting the lace handkerchief she seemed never to be without. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, ever the provocateur, sipped her tea with a smirk, her eyes darting from one guest to another as if enjoying the discomfort she had helped to sow. Mr. Felix Mortimer, the solicitor, paced near the door, muttering about the inconvenience of police inquiries. Dr. Ernest Caldwell, the archaeologist, leafed through a book on Roman artifacts, though his attention seemed elsewhere. Miss Sylvia Gray, the artist, continued her sketching, her pencil moving with feverish intensity, while Mr. and Mrs. Harold Baxter sat close together, their daughter Evelyn fidgeting beside them. Major Gregory Walsh, his military bluster subdued, stared into his coffee cup, his brow furrowed. Miss Marple's needles paused as she addressed Lady Beatrice. "Might I ask, Lady Beatrice, who had access to the library this morning, before breakfast was served?" The question, asked in her gentle, unassuming tone, drew every eye. Lady Beatrice hesitated, then said, "The library is open to all guests. It's a place of study, after all. But I can't imagine anyone was there so early, except perhaps Mr. Ridley." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes flickering too. "Miss Gray, you mentioned seeing the map in the library last week. Miss Gray, did you visit it again? Perhaps to sketch?" Miss Gray's pencil stilled, and she looked up, her cheeks flushing. No, not since last week. I was in my room this morning, preparing for breakfast. And you, Dr. Caldwell? Miss Marple turned to the physician, her tone mild. Your interest in archaeology suggests a fondness for old documents. Were you in the library this morning? Dr. Caldwell closed his book with a snap. I was not. I was in the billiard room with Major Walsh from 6:30, discussing a dig-in. Dorset. Walsh nodded curtly. That's right. We were there until breakfast. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Roland. And you, Captain Haverford, you seem a man who rises early. Were you about the house? Roland's jaw tightened. I was in my room until 7. Then I walked the grounds with Clara. We were back for breakfast at 8. Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. We were together the whole time. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. How curious, then, that Mr. Ridley was alone in the library, a scholar, struck down in a pursuit of knowledge. Or perhaps, she added softly, in pursuit of something else. Mrs. Trent laughed. A sharp, unpleasant sound. You're fishing, Miss Marple. Do you think one of us bashed poor Ridley over the head for that old map? I think, Miss Marple said, that people act for reasons they believe to be sound. A map, a treasure, a secret to any of these might provoke a desperate act. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the guests. Mr. Mortimer stopped pacing and fixed her with a cold stare. You're suggesting motive, Miss Marple. But where's the evidence? The police will find fingerprints, timelines, facts, not idle speculation. Facts, Miss Marple said, smiling faintly, are like stitches in a pattern. They must be placed carefully to reveal the whole. For instance, the pearl earring found near Mr. Ridley's body. Does anyone recognize it? She looked around the room, noting the reactions. Clara's hand went to her ear, then dropped quickly. Mrs. Baxter touched her necklace, a strand of pearls, but shook her head. Miss Grey's eyes widened briefly, but she said nothing. Evelyn Baxter, the youngest, bit her lip and looked at her. Mother, no one claims it. Miss Marple asked. How odd. Pearls are not easily lost. Yet this one was found under the library table, near a man who was murdered. Inspector Crane entered at that moment, his notebook in hand. Miss Marple, you're asking questions again. I see. His tone was gruff, but there was a glint of respect in his eyes. I've spoken to the staff. No one saw anyone enter the library before breakfast, but the maids confirmed the window was closed last night. It was opened sometime before Ridley was found. Opened from the inside, Miss Marple asked. Crane nodded. No signs of forced entry. And the paper in Ridley's pockets a sketch. Looks like a fragment of a map. Not the Haverford map, mind you, but something similar. Symbols, lines, no clear meaning yet. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A sketch, you say? May I see it, Inspector? Crane hesitated, then handed her the evidence bag. The paper was small, folded twice, with crude ink drawings of what appeared to be a tree, a bridge, and a cross. Miss Marple studied it, her mind recalling Miss Grey's mention of sketching the map. Most interesting, she murmured, returning it. I wonder if Mr. Ridley drew this himself, or if it was given to him. The inspector pocketed the bag. We'll know more once the coroner's done. For now, I need alibis for 7 to eat this morning. Captain Haverford, you first. As Roland recounted his walk with Clara, Miss Marple listened, her mind piecing together the timeline. The household had been awake by 7, the maids bustling, the guests dressing. Ridley, an early riser, had likely gone to the library to study, perhaps drawn by his interest in the map. But why was he killed? And why the earring? so conveniently placed. She glanced at Clara, whose pallor had deepened during Roland's account. The girl's nervousness was palpable, but was it guilt, fear, or something else? Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the library window, opened from within. A staged escape, perhaps, or a misdirection. And the sketch had Ridley been copying. The map, or had someone planted it to implicate him? As Crane moved on to question Mrs. Trent, Miss Marple leaned toward Lady Beatrice. Tell me, Lady Beatrice, was Mr. Ridley acquainted with anyone here before this weekend? A colleague, perhaps, or a rival? Lady Beatrice frowned. Not that I know of. He was recommended by Dr. Caldwell, who met him at a historical society lecture. They shared an interest in cartography, I believe. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. Dr. Caldwell's connection to Ridley was worth exploring, as was Miss Gray's sketching. The map, the murder, the earring, all were threads in a web of deceit, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it. As the afternoon wore on, Crane's questions grew more pointed, the guests' answers more guarded. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting a quiet counterpoint to the rising tension. The Haverford map had led to danger, just as the title of this grim weekend suggested. But it was the human heart, its fears, its desires, its secrets that would lead her to the truth. Chapter 5. The red herrings. The afternoon at Blackthorn Hall stretched on, heavy with the weight of suspicion and the drone of Inspector Crane's methodical questioning. The drawing room, once a haven of polished civility, now felt like a stage, where each guest played a carefully rehearsed role. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her corner with her knitting, observed the shifting dynamics with a keen eye. The murder of Mr. Thomas Ridley had sharpened the edges of the gathering, and the theft of the Haverford map now seemed a prelude to a far darker crime. Her needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm against the undercurrent of unease. Inspector Crane, standing by the mantel, was reviewing his notes with a furrowed brow. We've established that Mr. Ridley was killed between 7 and 8 this morning, he said, his voice carrying the authority of routine. The library window was opened from the inside, and the pearl earring suggests someone was present. Torment us to think so. But the sketch in Ridley's pocket is what interests me most. It's not the Haverford map, but it's close enough to raise questions. He held up the evidence bag, the crude drawing of a tree, bridge, and cross visible through the plastic. Someone here knows more about this than they're letting on, and I intend to find out who. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, lounging on the settee, gave a theatrical sigh. Really, Inspector, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. Ridley was a fussy old scholar, probably poking around where he shouldn't. Maybe he stole the map himself, and someone caught him at it. The suggestion landed like a stone in a pond, rippling through the room. Captain Roland Haverford, standing by Clara Winthrop, bristled. That's absurd, Lavinia. Ridley was a guest, not a thief. And why kill him? It makes no sense. Clara, her face pale as ever, nodded faintly but said nothing, her hands twisting her handkerchief into knots. Miss Marple noted the girl's silence, wondering if it stemmed from fear or something deeper. Mr. Felix Mortimer, the solicitor, adjusted his cufflinks with a nervous twitch. Mrs. Trent has a point, though. Ridley was obsessed with that map. I saw him in the library yesterday, poring over books on cartography. He was muttering about hidden lines and forgotten markers. Sounded half mad to me. Miss Marple's needles paused. Hidden lines, Mr. Mortimer. Did he elaborate? Mortimer shrugged. Not really. Just scholarly nonsense, I thought. But he was intense about it, like he'd found something important. Dr. Ernest Caldwell, who had been quiet, spoke up. Ridley was a serious historian. If he found something in the map, it could have been significant academically, at least. I told him last week about a theory that the Haverford treasure was linked to a Roman road on the estate. He was keen to explore it. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. A Roman road, Dr. Caldwell? How fascinating. Did he mention this theory to anyone else? Caldwell hesitated. Not that I know of. But he was in the library often, taking notes. He might have spoken to Miss Gray. She was sketching there, too. Miss Sylvia Gray, her pencil still moving over her napkin, looked up sharply. We talked, yes, but only about the map's artistry, the symbols, the style. He didn't mention any treasure. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Of course, and yet, a sketch was found in his pocket. Not unlike your own work, Miss Gray. The artist flushed, her pencil stopping. I didn't draw that. I swear it. No one's accusing you, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. But it does suggest someone was interested in replicating the map or misleading us about it. The Baxters, who had been unusually subdued, stirred. Mrs. Margaret Baxter, her pearl necklace gleaming, spoke for the first time. This is all very distressing. Surely the police can resolve this without dragging us all through suspicion. We were in our rooms this morning, all three of us. She gestured to her husband, Harold, and their daughter, Evelyn, who nodded vigorously. Evelyn, however, seemed less certain. I did step out for a moment, Mother, to get some air, but I was back by 7:30. Inspector Crane's eyes narrowed. Where did you go, Miss Baxter? Evelyn hesitated, her cheeks reddening. Just to the terrace. I didn't see anyone. Miss Marple noted the girl's discomfort, her quick glance at her parents. A lie, perhaps, or a half-truth. The terrace was near the library window. After all, Major Gregory Walsh, his military bluster returning, snorted. This is getting ridiculous. Ridley was killed. The map's gone, and now we're all pointing fingers. I say it's an outsider, someone who slipped in, took the map, and silenced Ridley when he caught them. A convenient theory, Major, Mrs. Trent said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. But that open window suggests someone inside, doesn't it? One of us. The room tensed, and Miss Marple felt the weight of unspoken accusations. Ridley's death had shifted suspicion onto everyone, and the sketch in his pocket was a red herring, designed to mislead. But to what end? To implicate Ridley as the thief, to point to someone else. She thought of the pearl earring, so out of place, and the open window, so conveniently ajar. Inspector Crane, sensing the rising tension, clapped his notebook shut. I'll need to search the rooms. If that map or any evidence is here, I'll find it. Constable, start with the library. Again, check every book Ridley touched. As the constable left, Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but clear. Inspector, might I suggest examining the library's rug? The earring was found beneath it, but the rug itself may hold other clues, threads, perhaps, or traces of the struggle. Crane gave her a long look, then nodded. Fair point, Miss Marple. You've a sharp eye. As the guests dispersed to their rooms under Crane's orders, Miss Marple remained. Her knitting resumed. She approached Lady Beatrice, who was staring at the empty mahogany box on the mantel. Lady Beatrice, a question, if I may. Did Mr. Ridley ever ask to see the map directly, or was his interest confined to books? Lady Beatrice frowned. He asked once, a few days ago. I showed it to him briefly, in the library. He was excited, almost too much so. Said it confirmed something he'd read about hidden markings. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Ridley's muttered words about hidden lines. Had he discovered something about the map, something worth killing for? Or was he merely a victim of his own curiosity? She excused herself and made her way to the library, where the constable was lifting the rug. The floor beneath was polished oak, but near the table where Ridley had fallen, she spotted a faint scuff mark, as if a shoe had skidded. And there, caught in a crack, was a tiny shred of fabric dark blue, almost invisible against the wood. "Constable," she said, pointing, "you might wish to collect that." The young man blinked, then carefully bagged the fabric. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the scuff mark. A struggle, perhaps, but a brief one. Ridley had been taken by surprise. Struck before he could defend himself, the killer had been quick, precise and familiar with the house. Returning to the drawing room, she found Roland and Clara in a quiet corner, their heads bent together. Roland's voice was low, urgent. "You mustn't worry, Clara. No one could think you had anything to do with this." Clara's reply was too soft to hear, but her eyes were wide with fear. Miss Marple watched them, her thoughts circling back to the earring. Clara had touched her ear during the discussion, a reflexive gesture. Did she own pearls? Or was someone trying to cast suspicion on her? As the clock struck 3, Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting a shield for her thoughts. The sketch, the earring, the open window, all were distractions meant to obscure the truth. But the truth, she knew, lay in the small things. A scuff mark, a shred of fabric, a nervous glance. The killer had made a mistake, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. Chapter 6, a clue in detail. Late afternoon light filtered through the leaded windows of Blackthorn Hall, casting intricate patterns on the drawing room floor. The guests, still confined under Inspector Crane's orders, had settled into a restless silence, their earlier bravado eroded by the grim reality of Mr. Ridley's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her accustomed corner, worked her knitting needles with a calm precision that belied the intensity of her thoughts. The theft of the Haverford map and the scholar's death were intertwined, she was certain, and the clues subtle, easily overlooked were beginning to form a pattern. Inspector Crane had returned from the library, his face set in a scowl. "We've found nothing new," he announced, addressing the assembled guests. The rug yielded that shred of fabric Miss Marple pointed out, dark blue, possibly from a coat or dress, but it could belong to anyone. The sketch in Ridley's pocket is still a mystery, and the map itself is nowhere to be found. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, ever quick to stir the pot, raised an eyebrow. A blue shred. How convenient. Half the people here wear blue. Why, Clara's dress last night was blue, wasn't it? Clara Winthrop, seated beside Captain Roland Haverford, flushed deeply. "It was, but I wasn't in the library." Her voice trembled, and she clutched Roland's arm. Roland's eyes flashed with anger. "That's enough, Lavinia. Clara was with me this morning, as I've said. You're throwing accusations without proof." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on Clara. The girl's distress was genuine, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear that went beyond mere accusation. Was it guilt, or the dread of being suspected? Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire about Clara's wardrobe later. Inspector Crane held up a hand. "No one's accusing anyone yet. But I need to know more about Ridley's movements. Lady Beatrice, you said he was in the library often. Did he have any particular habits, any routines?" Lady Beatrice, her composure strained but intact, nodded. "He was an early riser. I often saw him in the library before breakfast, reading or taking notes. He was particularly interested in the Haverford map, as I mentioned. He believed it held clues to a historical puzzle." Miss Marple spoke softly. "And the sketch in his pocket, Inspector, did it resemble the Haverford map in any specific way?" Crane frowned, pulling out the evidence bag. "It's similar in style, old-fashioned, with symbols, but it's incomplete, just a fragment. Could be a copy he made, or something else entirely." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes bright. Might I see it again, Inspector? Sometimes the smallest detail reveals the most. With a grudging nod, Crane handed her the bag. Miss Marple studied the sketch carefully, noting the precise lines of the tree, bridge, and cross. The ink was fresh. The paper crisped not the aged parchment of the Haverford map. But what caught her attention was a tiny smudge in the corner, barely visible, shaped like a partial fingerprint. Curious, she murmured, returning the bag. The ink suggests it was drawn recently, perhaps last night or this morning. And that smudge might it be worth examining, Inspector? Crane's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. I'll have it sent to the lab. You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. I merely notice what others overlook, Inspector. For instance, the library window. It was open from the inside, you said, but was it forced? Or was it simply unlatched? Crane replied, no signs of damage. Whoever opened it knew how to do it quietly. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the scuff mark and the shred of fabric. The window was a distraction, she suspected, meant to suggest an outsider. But the killer had been inside, close enough to strike Ridley with a paperweight. And that smudge on the sketch had Ridley drawn it himself. Or had someone planted it to implicate him? Her thoughts were interrupted by Miss Sylvia Gray, who had been unusually quiet. The artist stood abruptly, her sketchbook falling to the floor. I need some air, she said, her voice strained. She hurried to the door, ignoring the constable's protest. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the flush on her cheeks and the way her hands trembled. Poor child, she murmured, though her tone was thoughtful rather than sympathetic. Miss Gray's sketching, her interest in the map, and her sudden agitation were all pieces of the puzzle dot as the afternoon wore on. Inspector Crane allowed the guests to move about the house under supervision, provided they did not leave the estate. Miss Marple took the opportunity to visit the library, accompanied by a young constable who seemed more nervous than she. The room was as she had last seen it, save for the absence of Ridley's body, now removed for the coroner's examination. The brass paperweight, cleaned of blood, sat on a side table, and the rug had been rolled back to reveal the polished floor daub. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her stick steadying her, and examined the scuff mark she had noticed earlier. It was faint, a curved smear near the table's leg, as if someone had pivoted quickly. Nearby, the crack in the floor where the blue fabric had been found was now empty, the evidence bagged. She straightened, her eyes drifting to the window. It was still ajar, the latch loose but undamaged. She reached out, touching the frame, and noticed a faint scratch on the sill, not deep, but recent, as if something had been dragged across it. Constable, she said, has anyone examined the garden beneath this window? The young man blinked. Not yet, ma'am. The inspectors focused on the house. Perhaps you might suggest it, she said kindly. A footprint, a dropped item, such things can be most illuminating. As the constable jotted a note, Miss Marple's gaze fell on the table where Ridley had died. The book he'd been reading, a treatise on 18th century cartography, was still open, its pages marked with a pencil. She leaned closer, noting a faint underline beneath a passage about concealed symbols in early maps. Ridley had been searching for something specific, she was certain. Had he found it, only to be silenced? She returned to the drawing room, where the guests were reassembling for tea. Roland and Clara were absent, as was Miss Gray, but the others were present, their faces a mix of weariness and suspicion. Mrs. Trent, ever observant, caught Miss Marple's eye. Found anything, Miss Marple? Or are you just knitting your way to the truth? Miss Marple smiled. Knitting, Mrs. Trent, is an exercise in patience. One stitch at a time, the pattern emerges. Much like a mystery, Dr. Caldwell, seated nearby, chuckled. You sound like Ridley, always talking about patterns and hidden meanings. He was convinced the Haverford map held a secret beyond the treasure. Indeed, Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her interest was piqued. What sort of secret, Dr. Caldwell? The physician shrugged. He didn't say exactly. Something about a code in the symbols. He was planning to compare it to other maps in the library. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. A code, a smudge, a scratch on the sill. These were the details that would unravel the crime. But it was the human element that held her attention. Clara's fear, Miss Grey's agitation, Roland's protectiveness. Someone in this house was hiding more than a map. As tea was served, Miss Marple sipped her Earl Grey, her eyes resting on the empty mahogany box. The Haverford map had led to danger. But it was the small inconsistencies, the smudge, the scratch, the earring that would lead to the truth. She would watch, and she would listen, for the killer had made a mistake. And Miss Marple was determined to find it. Chapter 7. More lies surfaced. The evening shadows lengthened across Blackthorn Hall, casting a somber pall over the drawing room, where the guests had gathered once more. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and the clink of teacups seemed almost jarring against the oppressive silence. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner, worked her knitting needles with a quiet precision, her eyes moving from one face to another. The murder of Mr. Thomas Ridley and the theft of the Haverford map had woven a web of suspicion. And now, as the day drew to a close, the threads of deceit were beginning to unravel. Inspector Crane had spent the afternoon searching the guests' rooms, his constables combing through wardrobes and drawers with meticulous care. The results, announced as the group reassembled, were frustratingly inconclusive. No sign of the map, Crane said, his mustache twitching with irritation, nor anything to tie anyone directly to Ridley's death. The shred of blue fabric could belong to half a dozen outfits in this house, and the sketch in Ridley's pocket is still a puzzle. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, reclining on the settee, gave a mocking smile. So, Inspector, you've turned our rooms upside down for nothing. Perhaps the killer's cleverer than you thought. Crane's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Miss Sylvia Grey, who had returned looking pale and disheveled, spoke up. It's not just about the map, is it? Mr. Ridley was killed for what he knew or what someone thought he knew. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on the young artist. Miss Grey's agitation, so evident earlier, had settled into a quiet intensity, as if she were wrestling with a secret. An interesting observation, Miss Grey, Miss Marple said gently. What do you think Mr. Ridley knew? Miss Grey hesitated, her fingers tightening on her sketchbook. I don't know, but he was always talking about the map symbols, how they might mean something more than treasure. He said something to me last night about a truth hidden in plain sight. I thought he was just being dramatic. Captain Roland Haverford, standing by the fireplace, frowned. Dramatic or not, it got him killed. If he'd kept his nose out of family business, he'd still be alive. Clara Winthrop, seated beside him, flinched at his tone. Roland, please. He was a guest. He didn't deserve this. Miss Marple noted the strain in Clara's voice, the way her eyes darted to Roland before dropping to her lap. There was something unspoken between them, a tension that went beyond the events of the day. She made a mental note to speak with Clara alone, if possible. Felix Mortimer, the solicitor, cleared his throat. If Ridley was poking into secrets, he might have crossed someone with more to lose than a map. I handle the Haverford estates, legal affairs, and I can tell you, there are debts, old ones, from Sir Edmund's time. Maybe Ridley stumbled on something financial. Lady Beatrice, who had been silent, stiffened. Debts, Mr. Mortimer, the Haverford estate is solvent. I won't have you spreading rumors. Mortimer raised his hands defensively. I'm only saying, Lady Beatrice, that old families have old secrets. Ridley was a historian. He might have found something in the library documents, not just maps. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Documents. Mr. Mortimer, did you ever see Mr. Ridley with anything other than books or the map? Mortimer hesitated, then shook his head. No, but he was always scribbling notes. He kept a small notebook, leather-bound. I saw it in his hand yesterday. Inspector Crane's head snapped up. A notebook. We didn't find one on him or in his room. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. How curious. A missing notebook, a missing map. It seems Mr. Ridley's interests were dangerous indeed. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Grayson, the butler, entered, his face as impassive as ever. Pardon, madam, he said to Lady Beatrice, but the constable has found something in the garden, beneath the library window. He thought you should know. The guests followed Crane and Grayson to the garden, where the young constable stood by a flower bed, holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a single cufflink, silver with an engraved H. The constable pointed to the soil. It was half buried here, sir, near a footprint. Looks like someone stepped off the path in a hurry. Roland's face darkened as he saw the cufflink. That's mine, he said, his voice low. But I haven't worn those in weeks. They were in my room. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Roland. How could it? I don't know, he snapped, then softened, touching her arm. Someone must have taken it. I wasn't in the garden this morning. Miss Marple studied the cufflink, then the footprint a deep impression, suggesting weight or haste. A curious find, she said softly, and so conveniently placed, near the open window. Mrs. Trent laughed, her eyes glinting. Convenient, indeed. First Clara's blue dress, now Roland's cufflink. It's almost as if someone wants to point fingers. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mrs. Trent, whose relish for drama was becoming increasingly apparent. Was she merely stirring trouble? Or did she know more than she let on? The cufflink, like the pearl earring, felt staged a clue meant to mislead. But it also suggested carelessness. A crack in the killer's plan. As the group returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the garden path. The footprint was fresh, the soil soft from recent rain. Whoever had left it had moved quickly, perhaps in panic. She thought of Lily's sighting the previous night a shadowy figure near the library window. Had they returned, or was this another misdirection? Back inside, she approached Dr. Ernest Caldwell, who was sipping brandy by the fire. Dr. Caldwell, you mentioned a Roman road on the estate. Did Mr. Ridley ever discuss it with you in detail? Caldwell's eyes flickered with surprise. Not much, no. He asked about its route, whether it passed near the old oak by the bridge. I told him it was possible based on my digs. Why do you ask? Merely curious, Miss Marple said, smiling. The sketch in Mr. Ridley's pocket featured a tree and a bridge. It seems he was following a trail perhaps when you set him. On Caldwell's face tightened, but he said nothing, turning back to his brandy. Miss Marple noted his discomfort, adding it to her growing list of inconsistencies. The sketch, the cufflink, the missing notebook all pointed to a deeper motive, one tied to the map secrets. As the evening drew to a close, Inspector Crane announced that the coroner's report would arrive tomorrow, along with the results of the fingerprint analysis on the sketch. Until then, he said, no one leaves the estate, and I'll be watching. Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting tucked under her arm. As she passed Clara's door, she heard a muffled sob, followed by Roland's low, urgent voice. "Don't worry, darling. I'll fix this." The words were meant to comfort, but they carried a weight that piqued Miss Marple's interest. What, exactly, did Roland intend to fix? In her room, she sat by the window, her mind weaving together the day's clues. The cufflink, the footprint, the missing notebook. These were not random. Someone was orchestrating a narrative, casting suspicion on Roland and perhaps Clara. But the truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the small details: a smudge of ink, a scratch on a windowsill, a scholar's obsession. The map had led to danger, and now, as lies surfaced, it was leading her closer to the killer. Chapter 8. The emotional turning point. Second evening at Blackthorn Hall descended with a chill that seemed to seep from the very walls, as if the house itself mourned the loss of Mr. Thomas Ridley and the harmony of its guests. The drawing room, lit by the soft glow of lamps and the flickering fire, was a stage for strained civility. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, observed the gathering with her usual quiet intensity. The theft of the Haverford map and Ridley's murder had peeled back the veneer of politeness, exposing raw nerves and hidden truths. Tonight, she sensed, something would break. Inspector Crane had retired to the library to review his notes, leaving the guests under the watchful eye of a constable. The atmosphere was brittle, each conversation laced with suspicion. Lady Beatrice, her poise fraying, sat rigidly by the mantel, her eyes fixed on the empty mahogany box. Captain Roland Haverford and Clara Winthrop were absent, having excused themselves after dinner, a fact that drew Mrs. Lavinia Trent's sharp tongue. "Off whispering sweet nothings, I suppose," Mrs. Trent said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Or plotting how to explain that cufflink in the garden." Mr. Felix Mortimer, the solicitor, shot her a cold glance. "You're enjoying this, Lavinia. Stirring trouble when a man's dead isn't decent." "Decent?" Mrs. Trent laughed. "There's nothing decent about murder, Felix. And that cufflink points straight to Roland. Or perhaps Clara. She's been jumpy as a cat since this began." Miss Sylvia Gray, sketching in her corner, looked up, her face pale. "You're wrong about Clara. She's frightened. That's all. This house, it's suffocating." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes resting on Miss Gray. The artist's agitation had grown since the afternoon, her hands trembling as she drew. There was something she wasn't saying, something that weighed heavily on her. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her privately. Dr. Ernest Caldwell, sipping a glass of port, spoke up. "This is getting us nowhere. Ridley's dead, the map's gone, and we're all sniping at each other. I say we let the police do their job and stop playing detective." "Wise words, Doctor," Mr. Harold Baxter said, his voice gruff. His wife, Margaret, nodded, her pearl necklace catching the light. Their daughter, Evelyn, sat between them, her eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple noted the girl's unease, so different from her usual restless energy. Was it guilt, fear, or something else? Major Gregory Walsh, standing by the window, grunted. "Police or no, someone in this room knows more than they're letting on. That footprint, that cufflink, it's too neat, like someone's trying to pin this on Roland." Miss Marple's needles paused. "An interesting point, Major. The cufflink, the pearl earring, the open window all seem designed to direct our attention. But to what purpose? To accuse or to distract?" Before anyone could respond, the door opened, and Clara Winthrop entered, her face ashen. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying, and her hands clutched her handkerchief tightly. Roland followed, his expression grim but protective. The room fell silent, every eye on the couple. Clara, my dear, Lady Beatrice said, rising. Are you unwell? Clara shook her head, her voice barely audible. I need to say something. She glanced at Roland, who nodded, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. It's about the map. I saw it last night, after dinner. A murmur rippled through the room. Inspector Crane, who had just entered, stopped in his tracks, his notebook open. Go on, Miss Winthrop, he said, his tone sharp. Clara swallowed, her eyes fixed on the floor. I couldn't sleep, so I went to the library around 11. The box was open on the table, and the map was there. I looked at it, just for a moment. I didn't take it, I swear. But when I left, I heard someone in the corridor. I didn't see who it was. Roland's jaw tightened. Why didn't you tell me, Clara? I was afraid, she whispered. I thought it might look bad, me being there alone. And then, this morning, with Mr. Ridley. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her handkerchief. Miss Marple watched closely, her mind racing. Clara's confession was a turning point, a crack in the facade of secrets. But was it the whole truth? The girl's fear was genuine, but her story left gaps. Why go to the library so late? And who had she heard in the corridor? Inspector Crane's eyes narrowed. You're saying the box was open, Miss Winthrop? Lady Beatrice, you said it was locked last night. Lady Beatrice frowned. It was. I checked it myself at 10, before we retired. The key was in my safe. Then how was it open? Crane pressed, turning back to Clara. I don't know, Clara said, her voice trembling. It was just there, on the table. I didn't touch the lock. Mrs. Trent laughed, a harsh sound. Convenient, Clara. You stumble on an open box, look at a priceless map, and then someone else steals it. And now poor Ridley's dead. Quite a coincidence. Roland stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. That's enough, Lavinia. Clara's told the truth. She's no thief, and she's no murderer. Miss Marple spoke softly, her tone cutting through the tension. Miss Winthrop, you say you heard someone in the corridor. Could you describe the sound? Footsteps, perhaps, or something else? Clara hesitated, her eyes wide. It was soft, like someone trying not to be heard. A rustle, maybe, or a shuffle. I was frightened, so I hurried back to my room. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the scratch on the library windowsill, the shred of blue fabric, the footprint in the garden. Clara's story suggested someone else had been in or near the library last night, perhaps the thief or someone watching the thief. But it also placed Clara at the scene, dangerously close to the crime. Crane scribbled in his notebook. We'll need to verify this, Miss Winthrop. Anyone else in the library last night? No one spoke, though Miss Marple noted the quick glances exchanged between Dr. Caldwell and Miss Gray. Evelyn Baxter fidgeted, her fingers twisting a ring on her hand. The silence was telling, heavy with unspoken truths. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle. Miss Winthrop, when you looked at the map, did you notice anything unusual? A mark, perhaps, or something Mr. Ridley might have mentioned? Clara shook her head. It was just a map, old, with strange symbols. I didn't look closely. I was only there a moment. Miss Marple smiled faintly, but her mind was elsewhere. Clara's confession, while emotional, was incomplete. The open box, the rustle in the corridor, the timing, it all pointed to a moment of opportunity, seized by someone who knew the house well, and Clara, willingly or not, had placed herself in the heart of it. As the guests dispersed for the night, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the mahogany box. The map's theft had been the spark, Ridley's murder the flame. But Clara's admission had shifted the puzzle, revealing a glimpse of the truth. Someone had opened that box, someone had taken the map, and someone had killed Ridley to protect. A secret. The cufflink, the earring, the sketch haul were distractions. But Clara's story was a thread that led deeper. In her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting idle in her lap. She thought of Clara's tears, Roland's protectiveness, Miss Grey's agitation. The truth was close. She felt, hidden in the small inconsistencies, a rustle in the corridor, a smudge on a sketch, a cufflink in the garden. The map had led to danger, but it was the human heart's fears, its desires that would lead her to the killer. Chapter 9. The trap morning of the third day at Blackthorn Hall dawned gray and heavy, the sky bruised with clouds that promised rain. The atmosphere inside the house was no less oppressive. As the guests gathered in the drawing room under the watchful eye of Inspector Crane and his constable, the murder of Mr. Thomas Ridley and the theft of the Haverford map had cast a shadow over the once elegant gathering, and the air was thick with suspicion and unspoken fears. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner, worked her knitting needles with a calm precision that belied the intensity of her thoughts. Clara Winthrop's confession the previous evening had been a turning point, but it had also deepened the mystery, and Miss Marple knew the time had come to apply pressure to the web of secrets. Inspector Crane stood by the mantel, his notebook in hand, his mustache twitching with determination. "I've had word from the coroner," he announced. "Mr. Ridley died from a single blow to the temple, delivered with considerable force. The brass paperweight was the weapon, no doubt about it. No fingerprints, though wiped clean. The sketch in his pocket had a partial print, but it's smudged, not enough to identify. As for the blue fabric, it's wool, possibly from a coat or scarf. We're still analyzing it." Mrs. Lavinia Trent, reclining on the settee, gave a sardonic smile. "So, Inspector, you're no closer to catching the killer than you were yesterday. Perhaps you should let Miss Marple take over." Crane's eyes narrowed, but Miss Marple spoke before he could respond, her voice soft but carrying. "Mrs. Trent, I am merely an observer, but I do find that people reveal themselves when pressed, often in the smallest ways. For instance, the cufflink found in the garden Captain Haverford's. Yet he claims it was taken from his room, and Miss Winthrop's presence in the library last night. So conveniently timed with the map's theft." Clara Winthrop, seated beside Roland, flushed deeply, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "I told you, I didn't take it. I only looked at the map." Roland placed a protective hand on her arm. "Clara's told the truth, Miss Marple. She's no thief, and certainly no murderer." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "I do not doubt her sincerity, Captain, but truth has many layers, and I wonder if Miss Winthrop saw more than she realized." "A rustle in the corridor," she said. "Perhaps someone was watching her or waiting." The room tensed, the guests exchanging uneasy glances. Miss Sylvia Grey, her sketchbook clutched tightly, looked as if she might speak, but then pressed her lips together. Dr. Ernest Caldwell, sipping his coffee, avoided Miss Marple's gaze, while Mr. Felix Mortimer adjusted his cufflinks with a nervous twitch. The Baxters' Herald, Margaret, and Evelyn sat in a tight knot, their silence more telling than words. Major Gregory Walsh, standing by the window, muttered something about damned nonsense. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone gentle but deliberate. "Lady Beatrice, might we gather everyone in the library? I believe a reconstruction of last night's events could clarify matters. Sometimes seeing a thing played out reveals what words conceal." Lady Beatrice, her face pale, but composed, nodded. "If you think it will help, Miss Marple." Inspector Crane hesitated, then shrugged. "I'll allow it. But no one touches anything without my say-so. The group moved to the library, a room now heavy with the memory of Ridley's death. The table where he had been found was bare, the brass paperweight removed as evidence, but the open book on cartography remained, its pages still marked. The window, now closed, bore the faint scratch Miss Marple had noticed, and the rug had been replaced, though the scuff mark on the floor was still visible. Miss Marple stood by the table, her stick resting lightly in her hand. Let us imagine, for a moment, the events of last night. Miss Winthrop, you said you entered the library around 11, found the box open, and looked at the map. Could you show us where you stood? Clara, trembling slightly, moved to the table, her movements hesitant. Here, she said, pointing to the spot where the box had been. It was open, the map spread out. I didn't touch it, I swear. Miss Marple nodded. And the rustle in the corridor, where did it come from? Clara pointed to the door leading to the main hall. There, I think. It was faint, but it startled me. Miss Marple turned to the group. Let us consider who might have been in the corridor. The house was quiet, most of you were tired, but someone was awake, moving silently. Perhaps they saw Miss Winthrop, or perhaps they had just left the library themselves. Mrs. Trent laughed sharply. You're suggesting the thief was caught in the act? Or that Clara's lying to cover her own tracks? I suggest nothing, Miss Marple said mildly. I merely observe. For instance, the box was open, yet Lady Beatrice locked it at 10. Someone opened it between 10 and 11, a short window, requiring knowledge of the house and access to the key. Lady Beatrice frowned. The key was in my safe. No one could have taken it without my knowledge. Unless, Miss Marple said, there was another way to open the box. A duplicate key, perhaps, or a skillful hand with a lockpick. Mr. Mortimer, the solicitor, bristled. That's a serious accusation, Miss Marple. Are you implying one of us is a professional thief? Not at all, she replied, her smile disarming. But skill can be learned, and desperation can make one resourceful. Let us consider the map itself. Mr. Ridley believed it held a secret, code, perhaps, as Dr. Caldwell mentioned. Suppose someone else believed it, too, and was willing to kill to protect it. Dr. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. I told you, Ridley was speculative. He had no proof of a code, just theories. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him. Theories can be dangerous, Doctor, especially when they lead to truth. The sketch in Mr. Ridley's pocket crude, but deliberate. A tree, a bridge, a cross. Symbols that echo the Haverford map, yet drawn recently. I wonder if someone gave it to him to lure him to the library. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Miss Gray's pencil slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. I didn't draw it, she said quickly, her voice high. I told you, I didn't. No one has accused you, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. But your sketches are remarkably similar in style. Perhaps you saw something, or someone, that you haven't yet mentioned. Miss Gray's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. I don't know anything more. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the tremble in her hands, the way her gaze darted to Roland and Clara. The artist was hiding something, but whether it was guilt or fear, Miss Marple could not yet tell. Inspector Crane, sensing the tension, stepped forward. Enough of this. I want everyone to account for their movements last night, from 10 to midnight. No more half-truths. As the guests began to speak, their alibis overlapping and contradictory, Miss Marple stood back, her mind working. Roland and Clara claimed to have been in their rooms, though Clara's confession placed her in the library. Dr. Caldwell and Major Walsh said they were in the billiard room, playing a late game. Mrs. Trent was reading in her room, Mr. Mortimer, writing letters. The Baxters were together, as always, with Evelyn insisting she was asleep by 10. Miss Gray admitted to wandering the Carters, looking for inspiration, but denied entering the library. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the cufflink, the earring, the sketch, all carefully placed to mislead. The killer was clever, but not flawless. The scratch on the windowsill, the smudge on the sketch, the missing notebook, these were the threads that would unravel the truth. And now, with Miss Gray's near collapse and Clara's confession, the trap was set. Someone would slip, and Miss Marple would be watching. Chapter 10. The revealed library at Blackthorn Hall was shrouded in an expectant hush. As the guests assembled once more, the gray afternoon light filtering through the windows like a veil of uncertainty, Inspector Crane stood by the door, his arms crossed, while the constable hovered nearby, notebook at the ready. Miss Jane Marple, positioned near the central table where Mr. Thomas Ridley had met his end, leaned lightly on her stick, her eyes sharp and unwavering. The time for subtlety had passed. The trap she had set the previous day had yielded its fruit. And now, with the alibis laid bare and the inconsistencies glaring, she would unravel the truth step by step. Lady Beatrice, Miss Marple began, her voice calm and measured. "You have been most gracious in allowing us to gather here again. I believe it is time to explain what really happened to the Haverford map and poor Mr. Ridley. It is a sad business, but the truth, however painful, must come out." The guests shifted uneasily in their seats, a circle of suspects drawn tight around the room. Captain Roland Haverford sat protectively beside Clara Winthrop, whose face was pale with anxiety. Miss Sylvia Gray clutched her sketchbook like a shield, her eyes darting nervously. Dr. Ernest Caldwell and Major Gregory Walsh exchanged glances, while Mr. Felix Mortimer adjusted his cufflinks with habitual fidgetiness. The Baxters, Harold, Margaret, and Evelyn formed a silent trio, Evelyn's restlessness subdued into a tense stillness. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, however, met Miss Marple's gaze with a defiant smirk, her sharp features set in a mask of amusement. "Proceed." "Miss Marple," Inspector Crane said, his tone a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "But make it quick. I have a mind to make an arrest myself." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Patience, Inspector. Let us begin with the theft of the map." The mahogany box was locked at 10 o'clock, as Lady Beatrice confirmed, with the key in her safe. Yet by 11, when Miss Winthrop entered the library, it was open, the map spread out. No forced entry on the box, no signs of tampering. This suggests a duplicate key, made by someone familiar with the house and its secrets. Lady Beatrice gasped softly. "A duplicate? But how? The key is unique." "Not unique," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Merely rare. Someone with access over time could have had one fashion perhaps during a previous visit. The thief opened the box after 10, examined or took the map, but was interrupted by Miss Winthrop's arrival. Hearing her, the thief slipped into the corridor, rustling as they hid. Miss Winthrop left quickly, and the thief returned to complete the task, locking the box empty to delay discovery. Clara nodded, her voice whisper-soft. "That rustle, it was someone hiding." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Now, the map's significance." Mr. Ridley believed it held a code, symbols pointing not just to treasure, but to a family secret, a hidden document, perhaps, revealing that Sir Edmund Haverford had embezzled funds during the wars, funds that were never recovered. Such a revelation would ruin the Haverford name and expose ongoing financial discrepancies in the estate. Mr. Mortimer paled. "That's preposterous. The estate's affairs are in order, are they?" Miss Marple's eyes fixed on him briefly before moving on. Ridley, with his historian's eye, uncovered this in the library books, noting hidden lines and symbols. He confided in someone or was overheard that someone stole the map to prevent exposure. Dr. Caldwell cleared his throat. Ridley mentioned it to me, but only in passing. I thought it fanciful. Miss Marple nodded. Fanciful, yet fatal. Ridley was lured to the library early the next morning by a sketch-crude copy of map. Symbols slipped under his door perhaps, suggesting a meeting or discovery. He arrived. Book open to cartography, notebook in hand. But the thief was waiting. Struck him with the paperweight, wiped it clean, and staged the scene, opening the window to suggest an outsider, planting the pearl earring under the rug, and placing the sketch in his pocket to imply he was the thief. Inspector Crane leaned forward. The earring, who does it belong to? A red herring, Miss Marple said, stolen from Clara's room to implicate her. The cufflink in the garden Roland's, taken from his dresser and planted to cast suspicion on him. The footprint was made deliberately, the cufflink half buried. The shred of blue fabric from a scarf caught as the killer pivoted during the strike, causing the scuff mark on the floor. Mrs. Trent's smirk faded slightly. Clever staging. But who? One of us, you say? Miss Marple's gaze settled on her. Yes, Mrs. Trent. The room erupted in gasps. Mrs. Trent's face hardened, her eyes blazing. Ridiculous. Why would I steal a map or kill a nosy scholar? Miss Marple's tone remained even. Because, Lavinia, you are a Haverford by blood, but cut out of the inheritance by a bitter feud with Lady Beatrice's branch. You believe the map's treasure was your due, and when Ridley uncovered the embezzlement secret which would invalidate the estate's claims, and perhaps redirect funds to your line, you acted. You've visited Blackthorn often, enough to duplicate the key years ago. Last night, you opened the box, took the map, but Clara interrupted. You hid, then returned, locking it empty. Roland stared. But Ridley, you slipped the sketch drawn by you, in a style mimicking Miss Gray's to mislead under his door, luring him here at dawn. He confronted you, notebook in hand with his findings. You struck him, took the notebook now. Hidden in your room, I suspect, planted the clues, earring from Clara, whom you resent for marrying into wealth, cufflink from Roland, your rival for affection in the family. The blue fabric is from your wool scarf, the one you wore yesterday. The smudge on the sketch, your partial fingerprint, from haste. The scratch on the sill, from dragging a chair to reach a high shelf, hiding something briefly. Mrs. Trent rose, her face ashen. You have no proof. Proof, Miss Marple said softly. The notebook will confirm it, once searched. And your motive, financial desperation from your own debts, whispered in village gossip. You hoped to find the treasure, sell it quietly, but Ridley's discovery threatened everything. Crane stepped forward. Mrs. Trent, you'll come with me. Constable, search her room. Trent's defiance crumbled, her shoulders sagging. It was mine by right, she muttered. Beatrice hoarded it, and that fool Ridley, he would have ruined us all. As Crane led her away, the room exhaled. Lady Beatrice, tears in her eyes, turned to Miss Marple. How did you know? Human nature, my dear, Miss Marple said. Greed, resentment, fear, they leave traces, like stitches in a pattern. One tug, and it unravels. Chapter 11. The reflection storm that had threatened all morning broke over Blackthorn Hall. As the guests gathered in the drawing room, a steady rain drumming against the windows and casting a somber light over the scene. The revelation of Mrs. Lavinia Trent as the thief of the Haverford map and the murderer of Mr. Thomas Ridley had left the household in a state of stunned quiet. The air once thick with suspicion, now carried a mixture of relief and unease, as if the truth, though uncovered, had left scars that would not easily heal. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner with her knitting neatly folded in her lap, gazed out at the rain, her sharp eyes softened by a contemplative air. The case was solved, but her work, she knew, was not yet complete. Inspector Crane had returned from Mrs. Trent's room, where a search had uncovered Ridley's missing leather-bound notebook, tucked inside a hollowed-out book on the history of heraldry. The Haverford map itself was found folded in the lining of Mrs. Trent's traveling case, its aged parchment undamaged, but bearing the faint creases of her hurried concealment. She had been taken to the local police station, her protests fading into silence as the evidence mounted against her. The guests, now free from the shadow of suspicion, sat in a loose circle, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: shock, guilt, and, in some cases, a quiet gratitude toward the unassuming spinster who had unraveled the mystery, Lady Beatrice. Her composure restored, but her eyes still shadowed, approached Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough," she said, her voice low. "You've saved this family from further disgrace. But how did you see what we all missed?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands resting on her knitting. "It is not a matter of seeing more, Lady Beatrice, but of understanding what is seen. People, you know, are much like my knitting. Each stitch tells a story, and a single dropped stitch can unravel the whole." Mrs. Trent's resentment, her sharp words, her eagerness to cast suspicion on others, these were her dropped stitches. Captain Roland Haverford, seated beside Clara Winthrop, nodded slowly. "You suspected her from the start, didn't you? The way she kept needling Clara and me?" "Not from the start," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But early on, I noticed her interest in the map was not mere curiosity. She spoke of it with a proprietary air, as if it belonged to her, and her accusations, always so pointed, were meant to divert attention. Human nature, Captain, is predictable in its unpredictability. Mrs. Trent's bitterness toward your family was a motive I could not ignore." Clara, her face still pale but less strained, spoke softly. "I feel so foolish. I thought someone was trying to frame me, with the earring and all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And so they were, my dear. Mrs. Trent took your earring from your room, knowing it would cast suspicion. She chose Roland's cufflink for the same reason, a jealous attempt to tarnish your engagement. But her cleverness was her undoing. The blue fabric from her scarf, caught in the library floor, was a careless mistake, and the smudge on the sketch, her fingerprint, made in haste, confirmed her hand in the crime." Dr. Ernest Caldwell, who had been silent, cleared his throat. "I should have seen it. Ridley and I talked about the map, but I never thought. I didn't realize how far she'd go." Miss Marple's gaze rested on him. "You could not have known, Doctor. Mr. Ridley's discovery of the embezzlement secret was a threat to Mrs. Trent's hopes of reclaiming what she believed was her inheritance. She acted out of desperation, not calculation. But your mention of the Roman road was most helpful. It pointed me to the symbols in the sketch, which she used to lure him." Miss Sylvia Gray, her sketchbook now closed, looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "I thought you suspected me, Miss Marple. My sketches, they're so like the one in Ridley's pocket." Miss Marple's smile was kind. "Your talent, Miss Gray, was nearly your downfall. Mrs. Trent imitated your style to mislead us. Knowing your presence in the library made you a convenient suspect. But your agitation told me you were hiding only fear, not guilt. You saw something that night, didn't you? Perhaps not enough to name, but enough to make you uneasy." Miss Gray nodded, her voice barely audible. "I saw her, Mrs. Trenton. The corridor, near the library. She was holding something, a paper. But I didn't think. I was just scared to say. You did well to tell us now, Miss Marple said gently. The truth requires courage, and you have shown it. Mr. Felix Mortimer, his usual fussiness subdued, spoke up. What about the estate? This talk of embezzlement, will it ruin the Haverfords? Lady Beatrice answered before Miss Marple. The secret is safe, Mr. Mortimer. The map will be studied, but discreetly. The Haverford name will endure, thanks to Miss Marple. Miss Marple inclined her head. The name endures because truth, however painful, sets things right. Mrs. Trent's crime was born of greed and resentment, but it was also a lesson. Secrets, like old maps, can lead to danger if left to fester. Major Gregory Walsh, his military bluster softened, raised his glass. To Miss Marpleona, a toast. You've a sharp mind, Mum, and we owe you a debt. The others joined in, their glasses clinking in a subdued chorus. Miss Marple watched, her expression serene. I require. No thanks, Major. A puzzle solved is its own reward. But I shall take a sip of sherry, if you insist. As the rain continued to fall outside, the guests began to disperse, their conversations quieter, their steps lighter. Inspector Crane approached Miss Marple, his mustache twitching with a grudging smile. You've made my job easier, Miss Marple. I'll not forget it. You did the work, Inspector, she replied. I merely pointed the way. As she gathered her knitting and prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused by the window, looking out at the sodden garden. The Haverford map, now returned to its box, was a reminder that even the oldest secrets could not stay hidden forever. She thought of her own village, St. Mary Mead, where human nature played out in smaller dramas, jealousies, rivalries, quiet betrayals. Blackthorn Hall was no different, only grander in scale. With a final nod to Lady Beatrice, Miss Marple made her way to the waiting taxi, her stick tapping lightly on the gravel drive. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the air smelled of wet earth and roses. A pity, she murmured, that greed so often leads to sorrow. But such is life. She climbed into the taxi, her mind already turning to the next puzzle, the next pattern of human frailty. For Miss Marple, there would always be another mystery, and her little gray cells were ever ready to meet it. Chapter 12. The echoes of Secret's thrain had ceased by the following morning, leaving Blackthorn Hall bathed in a pale, misty light that softened the estate's stern gray stone. The guests, though no longer under suspicion, remained subdued, their conversations hushed as they gathered for breakfast in the dining room. The resolution of Mr. Thomas Ridley's murder and the recovery of the Haverford map had brought relief. But the shadow of Mrs. Lavinia Trent's betrayal lingered, like a stain that could not be fully scrubbed away. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the table with a cup of tea and a slice of toast, observed the gathering with her characteristic quiet attentiveness. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, a silent companion to her thoughts, which were now turning to the ripples left by the case ripples that, she sensed, had not yet fully settled. Lady Beatrice, presiding over the breakfast table, had regained much of her composure, though her eyes carried a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights. She addressed the group with a forced brightness. I hope you will all stay through the weekend. As planned, the engagement celebration for Roland and Clara must go on, despite everything. Captain Roland Haverford, seated beside Clara Winthrop, managed a tight smile. Of course. Aunt Beatrice, Clara and I are grateful for your support and for Miss Marple's clarity in this dreadful affair. Clara, her face less pale than the previous day, nodded. I don't know how we can thank you. Miss Marple, you saw what we couldn't what. I couldn't, even when I was in the library that night. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. You saw more than you realized, my dear. Your courage in speaking out helped unravel the truth. But I wonder, have you remembered anything else? About that night, a detail, perhaps, that seemed unimportant. Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing her handkerchief. I'm not sure. It was so quick. The rustle in the corridor. But I think there was a scent lavender. Maybe. I didn't think much of it then. Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. Lavender was common enough, but it was a clue to someone's presence, Mrs. Trent, perhaps, or another who had been near the library. Most helpful. Miss Winthrop. The smallest things often matter most. The other guests were quieter than usual. Dr. Ernest Caldwell, stirring his coffee, seemed lost in thought, while Mr. Felix Mortimer, the solicitor, ate in silence, his usual fussiness subdued. Miss Sylvia Gray, her sketchbook absent for once, picked at her food, her eyes darting to the Baxters' Herald, Margaret, and Evelyn, who sat in their customary tight cluster. Major Gregory Walsh, his military bluster muted, muttered about returning to London soon. It was Evelyn Baxter, the youngest, who broke the silence, her voice sharp with sudden emotion. I can't stand it anymore, she said, pushing her plate away. Everyone's acting as if it's over. But it's not. I saw something, too, that night, and I've been too scared to say. The room stilled, all eyes turning to the girl. Mrs. Margaret Baxter reached for her daughter's hand. Evelyn, darling, what are you talking about? Evelyn's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on. It was after dinner, around 10:30. I couldn't sleep, so I went to the terrace for some air. I saw someone in the garden near the library window, not a shadow, like the maid said, but a person moving quickly. They were carrying something, papers, I think. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone gentle. Can you describe them, Miss Baxter? A coat, perhaps, or a manner of walking. Evelyn shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. It was too dark, but they were tall, and they moved, purposefully, like they knew where they were going. I thought it was nothing, just a guess. But now she trailed off, glancing at her parents. Harold Baxter's face darkened. Why didn't you tell us, Evelyn? This could have helped the police. I was afraid, Evelyn whispered. After Mr. Ridley was found, I thought, what if they saw me watching? Miss Marple's mind raced. Evelyn's sighting, so close to Clara's encounter in the library, suggested a second figure in the night's events. Mrs. Trent had been the thief and murderer. But had she acted alone? The lavender scent, the papers in the garden, the purposeful stride, these were new threads in a tapestry that had seemed complete. She turned to Lady Beatrice. Might I ask, Lady Beatrice, if Mrs. Trent had any particular habits, a preference for lavender, perhaps, or a connection to someone else in the house? Lady Beatrice frowned, considering. Lavinia did use lavender water, I believe. It was a habit from her youth. As for connections, she was always close to Mr. Mortimer, our solicitor. They corresponded often about family matters. Mr. Mortimer's head snapped up, his cufflinks glinting as he adjusted them. Correspondence, yes, but nothing improper. I handled her legal affairs, as I do for many in the family. I had no part in this, of course, Miss Marple said soothingly, though her eyes lingered on him. Mortimer's nervousness, so often dismissed as a quirk, now seemed more significant. Had he known of Mrs. Trent's plans? Or was he merely anxious about the estate's secrets coming to light? Dr. Caldwell spoke up, his voice cautious. This talk of papers in the garden, could they be related to Ridley's notebook? Or something else he found in the library? Miss Marple nodded. A possibility, doctor. Mr. Ridley's notebook, found in Mrs. Trent's room, contained his notes on the map's code. But suppose there was another document, a letter, perhaps, or a record of the embezzlement that Mrs. Trent feared would surface. She might have passed it to an accomplice or hidden it in the garden. Inspector Crane, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. We searched the garden thoroughly. Miss Marple, nothing but the cufflink and the footprint. If there were papers, they're gone now, or hidden, Miss Marple said softly. The garden is large, Inspector, and papers are easily concealed. I wonder if Miss Baxter might show us exactly where she saw this figure. Evelyn, bolstered by her parents' presence, agreed, and the group moved to the terrace. The air cool and damp from the rain. Evelyn pointed to a spot near the library window, where the rosebeds met a low hedge. There, she said, they came from that direction, toward the oak tree. Miss Marple's eyes followed the path, noting the soft earth, still marked by the footprint Crane had found. She knelt carefully, her stick steadying her, and peered into the hedge. There, caught on a thorn, was a tiny scrap of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, with faded ink visible. Inspector, she called, you might find this of interest. Crane retrieved the scrap, holding it up to the light. Looks like part of a letter, he said. Old, but not as old as the map. I'll have it analyzed. Miss Marple straightened, her mind turning to the oak tree, the bridge, and the cross from Ridley's sketch. The map's symbols, the embezzlement secret. The lavender central pointed to a deeper layer of deceit. Mrs. Trent had been the killer. But had someone else known of her plans? Mortimer, perhaps, with his access to family records, or even Dr. Caldwell, whose archaeological interest might have masked a greedier motive. As the group returned to the house, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on the oak tree in the distance. The Haverford map had led to danger, but its echoes, secrets buried in the past, were still reverberating. She would watch. And she would listen, for the truth was never fully revealed until every thread was followed. Chapter 13. The net-tight tense drawing room of Blackthorn Manor was suffused with a heavy stillness, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth and the occasional clink of teacups as tea. He gathered company awaited Miss Marple's words. The air was thick with anticipation. A palpable tension that seemed to coil tighter with every passing second. The suspects, those who remained alive and present, sat in a semicircle of high-backed chairs, their faces a gallery of unease, defiance, and poorly concealed guilt. Captain Hastings, standing by the window, adjusted his cufflinks nervously, his gaze flickering between Miss Marple and the assembled group. The old lady herself sat primly in an armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. A picture of calm amidst the storm. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and bright as polished steel, surveyed the room. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft yet commanding, carrying the weight of certainty. Mesdames et messieurs, she began, her tone as precise as a metronome. We approach the moment when the truth, like a map long hidden, must be unfolded. The map, you see, has been at the heart of this affair from the beginning. Not merely the stolen map of Monsieur Grenville's, but the map of human nature, its twists, its secrets, its fatal desires. Lady Grenville, seated nearest the fire, shifted uncomfortably, her gloved hands tightening around her fan. Really, Miss Marple, she said, her voice brittle, must we endure another of your lectures? The police have their theories. Surely we can leave it to them? Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. The police, Lady Grenville, are admirable in their diligence, but they lack imagination. They see the footprints in the snow, but not the mind that chose where to step. No, it is necessary, I think, to gather you all here. to lay bare the threads of this mystery and weave them into a pattern that reveals the truth. Hastings, his brow furrowed, leaned forward slightly. Miss Marple, do you mean to say you solved it? The murder of Grenville, the disappearance of the map, all of it. Miss Marple inclined her head. Her knitting paused for a moment. Patience, mon ami. The truth is not a thing to be rushed. It must be approached methodically, step by step, as one navigates a labyrinth. Let us begin with the map itself, the map that led to danger, as our title so aptly suggests. She reached into her reticule and produced a small notebook, its pages filled with her meticulous handwriting. The map, stolen from Monsieur Grenville's study on the night of his death, was no ordinary document. It purported to show the location of a cache of jewels hidden by his great-uncle during the Napoleonic Wars. But the map was not merely a guide to riches. It was a catalyst, a spark that ignited the greed and fear in this house. And yet, the map was never truly lost, was it? Monsieur Carstairs, the young solicitor, seated at the edge of the group, started visibly, his spectacles slipping down his nose. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I told you, I only handled Grenville's legal affairs. I never saw the map. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Oh, but you did, Monsieur Carstairs. You saw it, and you understood its value not in gold or jewels, but in power. The power to manipulate, to control, to deceive. You see, the map was not stolen by an outsider, as we were meant to believe. It was taken by someone in this very room, someone who knew precisely where to look. A murmur rippled through the group. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, clutched her shawl tightly, her face pale. Dr. Whitby, the village physician, adjusted his tie, his expression guarded. Even young Violet Grenville, the late baronet's niece, seemed to shrink into her chair, her eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple continued, undeterred. Let us consider the night of the murder. Monsieur Grenville was found in his study at precisely 10:47 p.m., stabbed with his own letter opener. The window was open, the snow outside disturbed, suggesting an intruder. And yet, the footprints led nowhere, neither to the garden gate nor to the road. A clever trick. Nest's pause to make us believe an outsider had come and gone, when, in truth, the killer never left the house. Captain Hastings frowned, his mind racing to keep up. But Miss Marple, the police confirmed the footprints were fresh. How could someone stage that without leaving the house? Miss Marple's smile was almost mischievous. A simple matter, Captain, if one is clever. A pair of boots, taken from the stable, worn briefly to make the prints, then returned before anyone noticed. The snow was soft, easily manipulated. The killer needed only a moment to create the illusion of an intruder. But the true clue lay not in the snow, but in the study itself. The clock, you recall, was stopped at 10:47. Not broken, but deliberately stopped. Why? To fix the time of death in our minds, to make us believe the murder happened precisely then. But I submit to you, Ms. Amos, that Monsieur Grenville was killed earlier, perhaps as early as 10:15. Lady Grenville gasped, her fan dropping to the floor. That's impossible. I was in the drawing room with Violet and Dr. Whitby until 10:30. We heard nothing. Precisement, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but unyielding. You heard nothing because the murder had already occurred. The killer, knowing the habits of the household, chose a moment when all were distracted, the gramophone playing, the servants busy with the evening meal, and the stopped clock, a misdirection, to confuse the timeline and protect the true sequence of events. Dr. Whitby cleared his throat, his voice strained. This is all very theatrical. Miss Marple, But what of the map? If it wasn't stolen by an outsider, where is it? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her gaze fixed on the doctor. The map, monsieur, was never far from this house. It was hidden, yes, but not destroyed. I found it, you see, this very morning, tucked inside the lining of a certain gentleman's overcoat coat. That was conveniently left in the cloakroom during last night's dinner. A collective gasp filled the room. Carstairs leapt to his feet, his face flushed. This is outrageous. You have no proof. Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing him. Proof. Monsieur Carstairs, I have more than proof. I have logic, observation, and the truth of human nature. You see, the map was not the only thing hidden. Your motive, too, was concealed your debts, your desperation, your knowledge of Grenville's will. You believed the map would lead you to wealth enough to clear your name and secure your future. But when Grenville suspected your intentions, you acted. You killed him, staged the scene, and hid the map, intending to retrieve it later. Carstairs' face drained of color, his hands trembling. You can't prove any of this, Miss. Marple's voice was calm, almost gentle. Oh, but I can. The letter opener, wiped clean of fingerprints, was found in the study. But one small detail was overlooked, a trace of ink. The same ink used in your office. Monsieur Carstairs, clinging to the blade, and the boots in the stable. They bore a faint mark of polish, the same polish you use on your shoes. Small things, perhaps, but to the little gray cells, they speak volumes. The room fell silent, the weight of Miss Marple's words settling over the group like a fog. Hastings stared at her, marveling at the clarity of her mind, the precision of her deductions. The net was tightening, and the truth was almost within reach. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. Her knitting resumed, the needles clicking softly. Tomorrow, she said, we shall gather again, and the final piece of this puzzle will be revealed. For now, Ms. Amos, I suggest you reflect on the truth and on the consequences of deceit. As the group dispersed, their faces a mixture of fear and resignation, Hastings approached Miss Marple, his voice low. You're certain, aren't you, about Carstairs? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Certainty, Captain, is the reward of observation. But we are not yet at the end. There is one final twist, one last secret to uncover. Tomorrow, all will be clear. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the room, as the weight of her words lingered in the air. Chapter 14. The final twist. Morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of Blackthorn Manor's drawing room, casting a pale glow over the assembled company. The air was taut, as if the very walls held their breath, awaiting the culmination of Miss Marple's investigation. The suspects, diminished in number but not in tension, sat in their now familiar semicircle, their faces etched with varying degrees of dread, defiance, and curiosity. Captain Hastings stood near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on Miss Marple, who sat serenely in her armchair, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. Today, there was no pretense of domesticity. Her focus was absolute. Her presence commanding. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was clear and measured, cutting through the silence like a finely honed blade. Mesdames et messieurs, she began, her gaze sweeping the room. We have reached the final act of this tragedy. The map that led to danger has guided us not only to treasure, but to truth, a truth that has been obscured by lies, misdirection, and the frailties of human nature. Today, I shall reveal the full picture, and the murderer of Monsieur Grenville will stand exposed. Lady Grenville, her face pale beneath her powder, clutched her handkerchief tightly. Miss Marple, Must we endure more of this? You accused poor Mr. Carstairs last night. Surely that is enough." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with a hint of amusement, though her expression remained grave. "Poor Mr. Carstairs? Perhaps, Lady Grenville, but not in the way you imagine. Let us retrace our steps, for the truth is not a single thread, but a tapestry, woven from many strands. The murder of Monsieur Grenville, the theft of the map, the stopped clock, the footprints in the snow, all these were designed to mislead. But the little gray cells, they do not accept deception so easily." Hastings leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple, you said Carstairs was the killer. The ink on the letter opener, the polish on the boots, you laid it out so clearly. Is there more to it?" Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile faint but knowing. "There's always more, mon ami. Monsieur Carstairs played a role, yes, but he was not the mastermind. He was a pawn, a tool in a far more cunning game. To understand, we must return to the map, not merely its theft, but its purpose. The map was not stolen for its promise of treasure, but to conceal a greater secret, one that threatened to unravel a carefully constructed life." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Dr. Whitby, his fingers drumming nervously on the arm of his chair, spoke up. "What secret, Miss Marple? Grenville was a wealthy man, but he had no enemies, no scandals. What could possibly be worth killing for?" Miss Marple's gaze settled on the doctor, her eyes piercing. "No enemies, doctor, perhaps not in the open, but secrets have a way of breeding enmity. Let us consider the facts. Monsieur Grenville was killed at approximately 10:15 p.m., though the stopped clock suggested 10:47. The map was taken from his study, yet it was found in Monsieur Carstairs' coat. The footprints in the snow led nowhere, and the letter opener bore traces of ink from Carstairs' office. All this points to him, does it not? And yet, there's one detail that does not fit, a detail so small, so easily overlooked, that it nearly escaped even me." She paused, letting the silence stretch, her eyes moving slowly from one face to another. The ink on the letter opener was not merely from Carstairs' office. It was a specific shade, a deep indigo, used exclusively by one other person in this house. A person who had access to the study, who knew the value of the map, and who had a motive far more personal than greed. Violet Grenville, the late baronet's niece, gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Miss Marple, you can't mean." Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing her. "Patience. Mademoiselle Violet, let us examine the motive. The map, you see, was not merely a guide to treasure. It contained a notation, a hidden clause in Grenville's own hand, revealing a change to his will. A change that would have disinherited one person in this room, stripping them of their expected fortune. That person, knowing of the map's significance, acted to protect their future. They killed Grenville, staged the theft, and planted the map in Carstairs' coat to shift suspicion. Carstairs, his face ashen, stammered, "But I didn't know about any clause. I swear, Miss Marple, I only took the map because I thought it would clear my debts." Miss Marple nodded, her expression almost pitying. "I believe you, Monsieur Carstairs. You were desperate, yes, but you did not kill. You were manipulated, used as a scapegoat by the true murderer who stood to lose everything if the new will came to light." The room was deathly silent now, every eye fixed on Miss Marple. She turned her gaze to Lady Grenville, whose composure had begun to crack, her hands trembling visibly. "Lady Grenville," Miss Marple said softly, "you were in the drawing room with Violet and Dr. Whitby until 10:30, were you not? Or so you claimed. But the gramophone was playing loudly, and the servants were occupied. It would have been a simple matter for you to slip away for a few moments, to enter the study, to strike the fatal blow. Lady Grenville's eyes widened, her voice a harsh whisper. This is absurd. I love my husband. I had no reason to harm him. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, relentless. Love, Lady Grenville? Perhaps, but love does not always preclude. Betrayal. The new will, hidden in the map's annotations, named Violet as the primary heir, cutting you out entirely. Grenville had discovered your affair with Dr. Whitby. Had he not? An affair that, if exposed, would ruin you socially and financially. You could not allow that. So you acted, swiftly and decisively, using Carstairs' desperation to cover your tracks. Dr. Whitby leapt to his feet, his face flushed with anger. This is slander. You have no proof, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Proof, doctor? The indigo ink was yours, used in your medical notes. The letter opener, wiped clean, still bore traces of it. And the stopped clock. You were seen near the study at 10:15, adjusting your watch, a small act, but one that betrayed your presence. You and Lady Grenville conspired, did you not? She killed her husband, and you helped stage the scene, believing you could secure her fortune and your future together. Lady Grenville let out a choked sob, her hands covering her face. Dr. Whitby stood frozen, his defiance crumbling. The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. The map led to danger, yes, but it also led to truth. You underestimated the power of observation, the clarity of logic, and the stubbornness of an old lady's little gray cells. Hastings, his jaw slack, stared at Miss Marple in awe. Good Lord, Miss Marple, you've done it. You've unraveled the whole thing. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene. The truth, Captain, is always there, waiting to be seen. It requires only patience and precision to uncover it. As the police, summoned by Hastings, entered to take Lady Grenville and Dr. Whitby into custody, the room erupted into a flurry of whispers and gasps. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and stepped toward the door, her work complete. Chapter 15. The quiet departure of the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the grounds of Blackthorn Manor, bathing the estate in a serene glow that belied the turmoil of the past days. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth as Captain Hastings and Miss Marple stood on the gravel drive, their bags packed and ready for departure. The manor, now quiet after the storm of revelations, seemed to exhale, its secrets laid bare. The police had taken Lady Grenville and Dr. Whitby into custody, and the remaining residents, Violet Grenville, Mr. Carstairs, and the subdued household staff, were left to grapple with the aftermath of the truth. Hastings adjusted his hat, his expression a mixture of admiration and lingering disbelief. Miss Marple, he said, turning to the slight figure beside him, I don't know how you do it. To see through all the lies, the misdirection, and piece it together so neatly, it's nothing short of extraordinary. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained composed, her hands folded neatly over her reticule. Mon cher Captain, she replied, her voice soft but firm, it is not extraordinary, merely methodical. The human heart is a complex thing, but it follows patterns. Greed, fear, love, they leave traces as surely as footprints in the snow. One need only observe, and the truth reveals itself. Hastings shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. You make it sound so simple, but I was utterly lost. I thought Carstairs was our man, right up until you turned the tables on Lady Grenville and Whitby. The business with the indigo ink, the stopped clock, it was all so subtle. How did you know? Miss Marple's smile was almost imperceptible, a flicker of satisfaction. The little gray cells. Captain. They notice what others overlook. The ink was a small thing, but it was specific to be coincidence. And the clock, stopped at 10:47, was a lie meant to mislead. But the true key was the map itself, not for its treasure, but for what it concealed. The will that threatened Lady Grenville's future. Once I understood her motive, the rest fell into place. They began to walk toward the waiting car, the crunch of gravel underfoot punctuating the silence. Hastings glanced back at the manor, its windows glinting in the fading light. Poor Violet, he said quietly, to lose her uncle, and then to learn her aunt was behind it all. It's a heavy burden for a young woman. Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. It is heavy, but Mademoiselle Violet is stronger than she appears. She has the resilience of youth, and now, with the truth known, she can inherit what is rightfully hers. The map, in the end, led her to freedom, though not in the way anyone expected. They reached the car, where the driver stood ready to take them to the station. Hastings paused, his hand on the door, and looked at Miss Marple with a mixture of curiosity and respect. You know, Miss Marple, you never seem rattled, no matter how tangled the case. What's your secret? How do you stay so calm, Miss? Marple's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Calm, Captain, comes from order. The world is full of chaos, of passions that lead to ruin. But the mind can impose. Order can find the thread that ties all together. I am proud, perhaps, of my little gray cells, but I am humble before the truth. It is not I who solve the crime, but the truth itself waiting to be seen. Hastings chuckled, shaking his head. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. I dare say Scotland Yard could learn a thing or two from you. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile as she stepped into the car. They are welcome to try. Mon ami, but I fear they lack the patience for it. As the car pulled away, Blackthorn Manor receded into the distance, its imposing silhouette softening against the twilight. Inside, the remaining occupants faced their new reality. Violet with her inheritance, Carstairs with his shame, and the servants with their whispered gossip. But for Miss Marple, the case was closed, the puzzle complete. She leaned back against the seat, her eyes half closed, already turning over some new problem in her mind, her knitting needles poised for the next quiet moment. Hastings watched her, marveling at the unassuming figure who had unraveled such a complex web. What's next, Miss Marple? He asked, half joking. Another mystery, I suppose. Miss Marple's eyes opened, bright and alert. The world, Captain, is never short of mysteries. And where there is mystery, there is always a need for order. We shall see what comes. The car rolled on, carrying them toward the station and the world beyond, where new secrets waited to be uncovered by the relentless logic of Miss Marple's little gray cells.